Welcome to the Lynn H. Wood Archaeological Museum. The museum is honored to be the home of the William G. Dever Near Eastern Collection. As a former student of Dr. Dever's, it was my privilege to learn through the collection here how pottery typology and how archaeology and these artifacts work together. And it is our privilege, Dr. Dever's and mine, to introduce you to these objects, more than 200 of them, from Egypt, Babylonia, Persia, Syria, Palestine, Greece, Cyprus, and Anatolia. Illustrated through hundreds of photographs, drawings, and original art, this exhibit is designed to introduce you to artifacts in their ancient life setting. We hope that you enjoy this visit as you encounter Vessels in Time, a journey into the biblical world.
Spanning more than 3,500 years, the artifacts you see here are arranged in chronological order from before the time of Abraham to the period after the Apostles. Emphasizing the authenticity of the biblical account, the theme of each case links an aspect of ancient life to stories in the Bible. Our journey begins with the beginning of recorded history, the Early Bronze Age. The Mesopotamian city of Ur best illustrates the explosion of urban centers in the ancient Near East.
Here we have some very early pottery from our late Chalcolithic period, about 5,000 to 3,500 BC. In particular, the little lamp in the center of the case, which is only a simple bowl with some very faint pinches around the edge where a wick was placed to burn olive oil. And notice to the left of that, you have a more developed lamp in which the 4 niches now, a fixed number, are more pronounced. And we're going to come back to lamps to talk about a long typological series in which we can trace the change in shape and form for more than 3,000 years in these saucer lamps. The forms tend to be rather simple, but you might notice at the upper left a very beautiful, graceful pitcher called an Abydos pitcher from the fact that they have been found at Abydos in Egypt as exports from Palestine. So already in this period of the first cities in Palestine and the Old Kingdom in Egypt, we have trade back and forth between these two powers. On the right, you have a number of small vessels, including a very small one that we call a miniature, a little stumpy-based vessel from our Early Bronze III period. These are probably cultic. They're too small to be used for anything practical. They might also be included in burials. They're symbolic rather than practical. So in this early set of pottery, we're sort of setting up series that will change over long periods of time. And of course, one of the clues to dating archaeological artifacts is the change in style of pottery, other artifacts and implements as well, but particularly ceramic typology or ceramic change is a basic tool for the archaeologist and has been from the beginning 150 years ago.
The earliest evidence of writing comes from this period. Clay, not papyrus or parchment, was the primary medium for writing in the ancient Near East. The type of script on these tablets is known as cuneiform or wedge-shaped in Latin. The language that you see here is Sumerian, possibly the earliest tongue known to man. Many of these tablets recorded commercial transactions, such as receipts, invoices. Some were letters, some were literary epics, and others were inventories. These tablets here come from the ancient city of Ur, the original home of Abraham in the southern part of Iraq today, and they date to around the time when he lived there.
After the great dawn of urbanism came the dusk of civilization. Although it is unclear why urbanism collapsed, we know there was a major shift from city to rural life. City dwellings were replaced by a nomadic lifestyle, coinciding with the time of the biblical patriarchs.
Notice at the upper left there are several bowls that are made by hand but finished on a very slow wheel. But below them are some obviously superior vessels from Syria, actual imports, that are made on a fast wheel. So the urban culture of Syria prevailed, but in Palestine you have a collapse of the urban sites.
Look at the vessels in this case. Now, look at the pottery in the previous case. Can you tell the difference? The appearance of symmetrical horizontal lines, or wheel marks, hints to the introduction of the wheel in ceramic production. The earliest pottery was crafted by hand using a simple technique known as the coil method.
To the right, you see a large jar with the kind of protruding handles that we saw in the previous case. And notice these are still large and functional. And then above that, we've set up a series of handles from jars of this type, showing you how over 1,000 years these ledge handles, as they're called, developed. They became smaller over time. The edges are pinched up and then finally folded over. At the end of the series, they almost disappear and they become almost decorative. In the next case, we'll see how that happens.
The so-called four-spouted lamp before you is a unique design found only during this period. Lamps no longer began their life as bowls, as we saw in the previous case, where we had two lamps, one a simple bowl and the other with four little niches, but now they were designed specifically for the purpose of being lamps. The spouts that you see here were the result of simply a bowl being pushed in on the edges while the clay was still wet. And the resulting four spouts allowed for four different wicks to be placed in this lamp.
By the way, one of my students once conducted an experiment. She made a four-spouted lamp and a one-spouted lamp, and we got olive oil and some string for wicks, and we got a photoelectric meter, a photographer's meter, and we measured to see whether the four-spouted lamp gave 4 times as much light as the one-spouted lamp, and it didn't. It gave only twice as much light. So you have to ask, did they discover in time that the four spouts were inefficient, and so they reduced it to one? It's possible. In other words, accidental discoveries often triggered technological changes, and these in turn made larger technical changes in the culture in general.
One of the most remarkable features of this period is the abundance of burial sites. At a time when few permanent settlements are to be found, tombs are of great significance to archaeologists because of the information they give us about lifestyle, religion, and society.
Some of our best information about this Dark Age, the Early Bronze 4 period, comes from cemeteries, particularly in the hill country, where we have hundreds and hundreds of shaft tomb burials at sites where people never lived permanently. These pastoral nomads transported their dead between their summer and winter grounds and buried typically in the hill country. You see the photographs here of excavations I did in the Hebron Hills in the late 1960s and early 1970s, and here you see rows of these shaft tombs.
The picture on the lower right shows one of these tombs with the scattered remains of several different individuals. Many of their bones are missing, an indication that their remains were transported to this tomb from the place where they died. Genesis tells us that Jacob, while in Egypt, requested to be buried in the cave of Machpelah in Canaan, where Abraham and Sarah were buried. In fact, this idea continues later in the Old Testament, when the Bible refers to burial as being gathered to one's fathers.
In the pottery below, you see more of the early Bronze 4 pottery. Notice in particular, in the top row, a lovely vase, different from the other pieces, made on the fast wheel, an import from Syria. To the left of that is a little squat one-handled jug, and to the right, opposite of the handle, you see a little blob of clay, which looks like nothing. In fact, that's a vestigial spout. The earlier examples of these jugs have a functional pouring spout that can be quite long, and in fact in the previous case we saw one. And now the potter no longer understands what that thing is for, so he just puts a little piece of clay, he or she, and this is what we mean by vestigial features, features that are no longer understood, they're no longer functional, they're just decorative.
The Middle Bronze Age witnessed the return of the city-states and a resurgence of the urban culture. As people settled in cities and populations grew, the need for specialized crafts arose. One such craft was textile production.
This case attempts to deal with clothing, something that often is not well represented in the archaeological record. Textiles obviously do not tend to be well preserved. On the top left, however, you have a wonderful painting from the Beni Hassan tombs in Egypt dating around 1900 BC, which shows a party of 37 Semitic peoples, or Asiatics, somewhere from South Canaan, on their way to Egypt. Notice they look very different from the Egyptians, and you might notice that they tend to have multicolored cloaks and dresses. This reminds one, of course, of Joseph and his many-colored coat in the Hebrew Bible, and some scholars would place the stories of the patriarchs just in this period.
Although textile samples are rare, we do have other objects that can tell us something about Middle Bronze Age clothing practices.
At the right you see some copper pins, which we call toggle pins. They have an eye in the middle from which a string could be attached, and you could pin your garment at the chest and then wrap the string around the pin. Often we find these with the bones of females in tombs. It's possible the males might have used them as well.
A wide variety of ceramic forms appeared during this period. Represented here are some of the best examples of Middle Bronze Age pottery.
In the middle of the case, you have some of the finest pottery found in the pre-Roman history of Palestine from what we call the Middle Bronze I period, about 2000 to about 1750 BC. Notice the jug in the center. Not only is it beautifully made on a fast wheel, perfectly proportioned, but originally it was covered with a highly polished burnish, almost like a glaze. Just an exquisite piece of pottery. In the bottom you have examples of what we call piriform or pear-shaped juglets, some of them quite graceful too. At the left you have a dipper juglet. These are often found in large store jars where they were used to dip out oil or wine or other liquids. At the top left you have two examples of pear-shaped juglets, one a black polished juglet, very beautiful, and then above that one you have a similar style of juglet that has little holes punctured into it, and these holes are then filled with chalk. A beautiful kind of decoration. They were first recognized at the site of Tel el-Yehudiya in the Egyptian Delta, the Mound of the Jews, by coincidence, and they're very frequently found in Palestine. They were made both in Egypt and Palestine and traded back and forth.
Urban centers set the stage for technological innovation and craft specialization. One major innovation was the invention of the fast wheel.
The earliest versions of the wheel were turned slowly by hand using oil as a lubricant to reduce friction. But by the Middle Bronze Age, ancient potters invented the fast wheel by attaching a flywheel to the wheelhead using a wooden rod that goes through the center of both, as shown in the drawing here on the right. The potter uses his feet to kick the flywheel while his hands are free to work on the clay. For this reason, the first wheel is often called a kick wheel.
At the bottom we have a series of extremely well-made vessels showing you what the fast wheel made possible. In the center is a lovely footed goblet, which I happen to know is from Jericho, along with the vessels below it. We took some of these vessels to a modern Palestinian potter, a skilled woman, and asked her to imitate them, and she could not make them. Even with a fast wheel and a modern kiln, she could not reproduce the pottery of this period. It is so lovely. These vessels are probably made in 3 or 4 pieces and put together, and they're so fragile. The ware is eggshell thin, and they've been fired at temperatures in excess of 1500 degrees in the kiln. We call these carinated bowls to the left because they have a kind of shoulder, and again, they're extremely graceful vessels. These are luxury wares. Not everybody had pottery of this type, and not every woman, every village potter could make vessels like these.
Although bronze alloys were known to early Bronze Age craftsmen, true bronze, the alloying of copper and tin, did not become the standard until this period. Tin bronze is stronger than plain copper or iron, and it is highly resistant to corrosion.
Somewhere somebody learned how to mix tin with copper to produce tin bronze, a major technological advance. It made possible a whole new arsenal of weapons. At the upper left you see, for instance, an axe called a duckbill axe. It looks like the top of a duck's bill. And to the right of that, a javelin. And these are no longer made in copper, they're made in true tin bronze.
Late Bronze Age Canaan is characterized by a wealth of imported pottery manufactured in different parts of the Mediterranean world. Canaan was a land bridge that connected Africa, Asia, and Europe, making Canaan a corridor of commerce that linked the major cities from Mesopotamia to Egypt.
Very often, archaeology supplements the story in the Hebrew Bible. The writers of the Bible are not much interested, for instance, in trade. But in archaeology, we often find items that are clearly imports, and from these we can reconstruct something of ancient trade. We know that there was maritime trade. Here you see an illustration of the famous Uluburun shipwreck. We have many shipwrecks from the Late Bronze Age, 1500 to about 1200 BC. In particular, in Palestine, they favored imports from Cyprus. At the bottom of this case, you see a number of vessels, either from Cyprus or, very interesting, imitations of Cypriot vessels. On the right, above, you see a dark brown, very graceful vessel from Cyprus, an actual import. We think these were probably imported with opium, which was used for medicinal purposes, and then the vessels, being very beautiful, were kept as heirlooms. But to the right of the dark vessel, you see one that looks very much like it, but clearly made in a different way, wheel-made, rather crudely formed. This is a local imitation made in Palestine based on a Cypriot import. So if people couldn't afford the real thing, they managed with imitations. At the left, you see a large bowl with a broken handle. That's a Cypriot bowl, handmade like most of the Cypriot pottery, and it's probably an imitation of a gourd. The Cypriot potters had all sorts of exotic ideas, and they loved themes taken from nature.
Ancient trade routes extended far beyond Cyprus and Syria. Although more rare, archaeologists also have found ceramic imports from other Mediterranean civilizations, such as Mycenaean Greece.
At the bottom, you see a lovely vessel, a one-handled bowl. Very rare. There are only a half a dozen or so known from Palestine from excavations. This is not Cypriot. This is from the mainland of Greece. This is Mycenaean pottery, which was also imported from a greater distance.
The Late Bronze Age witnessed the emergence of several culturally distinct Canaanite nations. Prominent among these are Israel and Philistia.
The first mention of Israel outside the Bible is in the famous Stela of Meremta, or the Israel Stela found by Sir Flinders Petrie in 1896 in Egypt. At the bottom of the stela we have an inscription that says, "Plundered is Canaan with every evil, carried off is Ashkelon, captured is Gezer, Yenoam is made non-existent. Israel is laid waste, its seed is not." The mention of Israel by the ancient king Merneptah indicates that Israel is already in the land of Canaan by the date of this stela, Meremtah's 5th year, around 1209 BC. And moreover, that Israel is in fact an important entity, a significant entity, along with some of the major city-states of Canaan, like Ashkelon, Gezer, and Yenoam, cities that were most important in the Late Bronze Age.
In a similar inscription commissioned by Pharaoh Ramses III, a successor of Meremtah, the Philistines are described as part of a migratory group of peoples who came from the Mediterranean Sea.
We have, of course, archaeological evidence of a series of new peoples, all beginning around 1200 BC. The Phoenicians replaced the Canaanites along the coast. The sea peoples, including the biblical Philistines, invade from the Mycenaean world and from Cyprus, settling in the delta of Egypt and along the Levantine coast in what is now Israel and Lebanon to the north. It's interesting that the biblical writers know about the Philistines, of course. They don't tell us very much about them because they're the enemies of early Israel, but what they do know is essentially correct. And archaeology in the last 20 years has brought to light a vast amount of information on the sea peoples and the Philistines and others, so that we know almost as much about them as we do about the earliest Israelites.
While trade and migration facilitated the import of foreign goods, only the elite members of society could afford to pay for these. Imitation pottery, cheaper and easier to acquire, became commonplace in Canaan.
At the left of this case, you see again some of these imitations. These little squat vessels with two handles are called pyxides. The singular is pyxis. And here you see on the left one that's closer to the Mycenaean style, and then one on the right in a dark red ware that's clearly a local imitation. The potter scarcely has any idea of what the late Bronze Age example should have looked like.
The area you are now standing in is meant to give you a glimpse into the domestic life of ancient Israel. As you gaze into this model room of an ancient Israelite house, pay attention to the ceramic vessels reproduced here. Can you find the originals in the cases behind you?
In the center here, you have the best that we can probably do in reconstructing what a typical Israelite house looked like. Notice the plan of the house. It's a large house based on a kind of 4-room design, or 3 rooms around the courtyard. These stereotypical houses are found at nearly every Israelite and Judean site that we've ever excavated. They are typical farmhouses or rural houses, although they can be developed for townhouses as well, indicating that most people did not live in large cities or towns. They lived in the countryside, in villages.
In the ancient Near East, the principal fibers used for weaving were sheep wool, goat hair, and flax, a fibrous plant used to make linen. In early Israel, most of the household cloth was woven from sheep's wool, though more durable goat hair was used for tenting and sackcloth.
Here we have a reproduction of an ancient loom. Most of the things that people used were made in the household, and women probably wove the garments used by all of the family, as well as the floor coverings, sacks and other things like that. And we often find a burned loom on the floor of a destroyed building with all of the loom weights lined up in a row, just the way they fell.
Everyday serving vessels are well attested in the archaeological record. Some of these vessels are also mentioned in the biblical text. Look at the case on the left, where some of the best preserved examples are displayed.
There are about 30 terms for ceramic vessels in the Hebrew Bible, but it's hard to connect them with the actual vessels we have. On the right, you see a peculiar vessel with a high shoulder, which we call a Judean water decanter. Now, I think that is probably the vessel the biblical writers mean by using the term bakbuk. Why would they call such a vessel bakbuk? Because if you pour from it, the mouth is so constricted that it sort of gurgles or bubbles, and it's a sound like bakbuk, and I think that's probably the vessel that the biblical writers are referring to. Toward the left you see a footed vessel, a chalice, and that may be what the Hebrew Bible means by the term gabi'ah, which is some sort of footed vessel. But it's absolutely intriguing to try to look at the things we actually have and then look at the things that happen to be mentioned in the Hebrew Bible and see if we can come to some sort of convergence. At the left you see a beer jug. People made barley beer of various kinds. This is a particularly fine example of a beer jug. One might remember the story of Samson, who went down to visit Delilah and stayed occasionally for parties and probably drank a little too much. And if so, he drank out of a beer jug.
So far in this exhibit, we have seen and discussed pottery, clothing, weapons, and now an ancient Israelite house. But can archaeology tell us anything about entertainment and amusements in the ancient world?
At the lower left you see an odd spindle-shaped vessel, which if you pick it up can be made to make a noise. It's full of pebbles. We call these rattles. Now, are they toys to amuse children? Or possibly were they used in the cult? We know that music was a part of religious ceremonies of every kind. We have examples of musical instruments, flutes and drums and tambourines and things like that, and even some trumpets. So perhaps these were used in religious ceremonies. I think they probably were. They're typically Judean and found only in the 8th and 7th century. They're often found in tombs, but what their original use was, we simply don't know.
Following the period of the Judges came the political unification of the tribes of Israel under David and Solomon. This period, known as the United Monarchy, ushered in a golden age in Israel's history.
One of the most hotly contested questions in the archaeology of Israel today is the question of the United Monarchy. According to the minimalist skeptics of various sorts, there was no such thing. It's a biblical construct. In other words, there may have been kings like Saul, David, and Solomon in the 10th century, but there was no real state until the 9th century under Ahab and other kings. One of the ways that we've tried to distinguish between the 10th and the 9th century is the change from hand-burnished pottery to wheel-burnished pottery. If you look at the vessels in this case, you will see that they're covered with a heavy, dark red slip, which is applied to the clay when it's only leather hard before firing. This is then rubbed into the clay as a paint or a coloring agent, and then when the vessel is fired, it takes on a high gloss. In the background, you will see the kind of stone that was probably used for this process. Now, when it's done by hand, the strokes are irregular, and you can easily spot the technique. We have thought for a long time that in the 10th century, this red burnished pottery was done by hand, but in the 9th century, the burnishing was done on the wheel, and you can see the regular symmetric rings. You can spot the difference even on a sherd.
Archaeologists have uncovered monumental structures dating to the 10th century BC, leading some to identify these fortifications with those mentioned in the Bible.
Now, according to 1 Kings 9:15 following, Solomon fortified or refortified 4 principal sites: Jerusalem, his capital, and then 3 sites are named: Hatzor, Megiddo, and Gezer. Now, in the photograph, you will see almost identical 4 entryway gates at these very same 3 sites, one of them the one at Gezer excavated by myself and others. Now, according to Yadin, these were all built on a set of blueprints, a single plan devised by Solomon's engineers in Jerusalem. They are strikingly similar. But the minimalists, including some Israeli archaeologists, say no, these gates belong to the 9th century and have nothing to do with the United Monarchy.
The architecture of these gates is one of the keys to their dating. I mean, when we think about it, the Bible says that Solomon hired masons from Hiram, the king of Tyre in Phoenicia. The Phoenicians at this time were the master craftsmen and the best builders of their age, and they wanted to show the Israelites how to hew out cut stones as they had been instructed to build various elements in Jerusalem and around the area as well. The smoothly cut stones, which we call ashlar masonry, is evident at all 3 of these gates, at Hatzor, Megiddo, and Gezer, and they testify to the technique of the Phoenician craftsmen. But there's another feature here that is important. All three of these gates have 6 chambers or rooms. They're the largest gate structures ever to be excavated. And I've personally excavated the gate at Gezer, and I've worked for several years at Hatzor. And based on the evidence at hand, both architectural and the ceramic dating of these gates, they must date to the 10th century, the time of Solomon.
Following the death of Solomon came the demise of the unified kingdom of Israel. 2 independent kingdoms arose, Israel in the north and Judah in the south. Israel existed as an independent state until its destruction in the late 8th century BC.
The end of the northern kingdom comes in the years between about 735 BC and 701 BC. During that period, the Neo-Assyrian Empire advanced westward on its way to the Mediterranean, and Israel, together with the smaller Aramid and Phoenician and other states in the area, was crushed. One of the evidences for the Assyrian occupation is seen in this case in the upper left hand, where you see a small carinated bowl, very different from the local pottery. This is Assyrian palace ware, and it is imported in this case from Assyria. And this, together with a lot of other material, indicates that the Assyrians really did destroy the northern kingdom and incorporate it into their empire. You see some of the weapons of destruction here. Above that you see 2 sling stones and an illustration of how these were used.
With the northern kingdom out of the picture, the Assyrians turned their attention to Judah, who had revolted under the leadership of Hezekiah. In 701 BC, the Assyrian king Sennacherib led a punitive campaign against Judah, bringing the southern kingdom to the brink of destruction.
While we can't say as much as we'd like about the earlier Assyrian destructions between, say, 735 and 721, we can say a great deal about the destructions caused by Sennacherib in 701 when he advanced into Judah, this time in the south. The set piece there is the Battle of Lachish, which took place that year. We have several sources. We have the Assyrian reliefs now in the British Museum, found in the palace of Sennacherib in what is now Iraq, and here you see some drawings taken from that. We have the brief mention in the Bible of Sennacherib being at Lachish before he besieged Jerusalem in the days of Hezekiah. And we have the archaeological evidence of both the British excavations and the more recent Israeli excavations. In fact, the fall of Lachish is the best documented military event in ancient history. And here archaeology has been brilliant in bringing to life dramatic and horrible evidence of the destruction. 1,500 bodies were found in the water system where the Assyrians dumped the victims. The siege works and ramps have been found. Hundreds of ballista, like the one shown in the center of this picture, thrown by the Assyrians up against the walls. The collapsed city walls, stones were burned and rolled all the way down to the bottom of the slope. So there is no doubt about this destruction.
The Assyrian invasion of Judah included not only the destruction of Lachish, but also many surrounding settlements that depended on Lachish for protection. These towns and villages are numbered among the 46 Judean cities that were purportedly destroyed by Sennacherib.
We have not only the material culture evidence of the destruction of Lachish, we actually have some textual evidence. In the guard room of the gate, on the floor in the ashes, there was found a series of more than 20 ostraca, or letters in this case, written in ink on bits of pottery. And here you see at the upper right a photograph of number 4. And in part, that one reads, "And let my Lord know that we are watching for the signals of Lachish, according to all the signs which my Lord has given, for we do not see Azekah." So this letter must be written from a site a few miles distant from Lachish, between Lachish and Azekah. And if we are correct, it was written perhaps in the last days even before the fall of Lachish, when these outlying villages could no longer see Azekah because it had been destroyed already, and they were appealing to Lachish for help. but help never came. And a few days later, or at most a few weeks later, Lachish itself was destroyed, and these letters were left on the floor of the guard room of the gate.
Though Sennacherib ravaged the Judean countryside, the southern kingdom survived the Assyrian onslaught and endured for another 115 years, until Nebuchadnezzar II, king of Babylon, destroyed Jerusalem in 586 BC. Most of the pottery in this case was crafted in the last century of Judah's history.
Here in this case, we have a collection of very late pottery toward the end of the monarchy. Most of this is 7th century. Notice at the top, the juglets, the one on the left is very degenerate, very poorly made. It's wheel made, but they didn't bother to smooth it out. It's baggy in form and shape. And this indicates that toward the 7th century, after several centuries of relative prosperity, the Israelite Judean kingdom is close to collapse even from within. And the pottery shows it. We also have from this same period not only a number of seals, but we have bulla, clay impressions, which were made with a signet ring, a seal. And among these, we have at least 2 examples of a sealing, which reads very interestingly, belonging to Baruch, the son of Neriyahu the scribe. This would be the secretary of Jeremiah. And many people think that this same Baruch was one of the major authors of large parts of the Hebrew Bible, an eyewitness to these events late in the last days of Judah.
Following the death of Sennacherib's grandson Ashurbanipal, Assyria found itself weakened and besieged on all sides by the very peoples it had sought to control. In 612 BC, the combined Babylonian and Median forces defeated the Assyrian army and captured Nineveh, their capital. The Neo-Assyrian Empire was at an end.
For the glory of his name, Nebuchadnezzar set out to build Babylon, the greatest city the world had ever known. Of course, he had earlier built other edifices in this particular city, but perhaps the most famous is the Ishtar Gate, as you can see here in this picture reconstructed now in the Pergamon Museum in Berlin. Nebuchadnezzar was more proud of his building accomplishments than his military victories. It is his pride in this that causes him to proclaim in the book of Daniel, "Is not this Babylon the Great, which I myself have built as a royal residence, by the might of my power and for the glory of my majesty?" A similar quote of Nebuchadnezzar has been found in an ancient inscription. In it, Nebuchadnezzar records his building activities and boasts, "My name will be remembered."
Mud brick was the chief building material of the Babylonian architect. Some bricks were sun-dried and some were baked. It has been estimated that 15 million baked bricks were used in Nebuchadnezzar's building projects. As the picture on the right shows, the bricks are usually square and often bear cuneiform inscriptions, generally made with a stamp.
After excavations were conducted in Babylon in 1899 by the Germans, no one would doubt any longer that Nebuchadnezzar was a real historical figure. But some have questioned how possible it was that Nebuchadnezzar could have claimed that he was the builder of Babylon, when in fact Babylon had existed for centuries before he was born. The fact is that by Nebuchadnezzar's time, Babylon had been destroyed many times. The most recent destruction carried out by the Assyrian king Sennacherib in 689 BC, some years after he attacked Jerusalem. Though subsequent Assyrian kings partially restored the city, it wasn't until Nebuchadnezzar's time that a full reconstruction and expansion took place. Thanks to archaeology, we can now look at thousands of bricks like the one here in this case, where Nebuchadnezzar boasted that he was the one who had built the great city of Babylon. Here on this brick, we find the beginning of his name, Nebu, the name of the Babylonian god, followed by other elements, identifying him as the builder of this city, along with other monuments that he left behind there.
In 539 BC, Cyrus the Great of Persia conquered Babylon. The Bible records that Belshazzar, who had been ruling Babylon on behalf of his father, Nabonidus, saw handwriting on his palace wall during a feast, which the prophet Daniel interpreted as the end of the Neo-Babylonian Empire. Shortly thereafter, the Persians took control of the city.
Under Cyrus, the empire of the Medes and the Persians expanded to become the largest state the world had seen. Yet it was during the reign of his son Darius I that the empire reached its greatest extent. His empire included the territory of the Medes, Persians, Babylonians, Assyrians, Phoenicians, Lydians, Thracians, and Egyptians. Darius, like Nebuchadnezzar before him, was well known for his many building projects, the largest being the construction of the new capital at Susa. Susa was founded as a royal residence and administrative center around 520 BC, long before he began to erect a similar structure at Persepolis. It would remain one of the 4 principal residences of the Persian kings until its destruction by Alexander the Great.
The crowning piece of Darius' grand design for Susa was the construction of a great audience hall for the king. This architectural wonder was made up of 3 colossal porticos, 2 monumental stairways, 1 main chamber, and 72 stone columns sitting on a platform measuring 130,000 square feet, or more than 2 football fields in size. Though begun by Darius, the Apadana, as an audience hall was known, was completed by Xerxes I, Darius' son and successor.
The story of Esther is one of the most beloved stories of the Bible. But have you ever wondered what the building really looked like where she lived, and what the hall looked like where she appeared before King Ahasuerus or Xerxes on that fateful day when she asked for the freedom of her people? Here we have a partial model of the Apadana at Susa, biblical Shushan. The main hall was supported by 36 stone columns, measuring 65 feet tall. That's over 7 stories, or if you can imagine, you just came out in this museum from the atrium, 3 times the height of the atrium here at Southern Adventist University. The columns of the main hall sat a distance of 28 feet apart. We call this the hypostyle hall, going back already to earlier Greek prototypes. Some archaeologists estimate that the Apadana could have held as many as 10,000 guests during a given extravaganza or party that the king could have held. And so it is not hard to imagine how terrifying it must have been for Esther to walk through this hall surrounded by guards on all sides, wondering whether King Xerxes on this day would extend to her his scepter of favor.
After the fall of Babylon, Cyrus the Great allowed the Jews to return to their homeland in 537 BC. Judah became part of the 5th province of the Persian Empire, where the Jews enjoyed limited independence.
According to the accounts of Ezra and Nehemiah, a priestly elite ruled the Jewish nation with Jerusalem as the seat of government. There were as well provincial governors, some of them which were Jews themselves. This relative state of autonomy would ultimately change after the conquests of Alexander the Great. Alexander was one of the most successful military commanders in history. His father, Philip II of Macedon, had unified Greece by bringing the Greek city-states under his control, and Alexander used the might of the entire Greek world to launch an attack on Persia in 333 BC. Although a Macedonian by birth, Alexander was brought up as a Greek and felt a deep hatred toward the Persians for their invasion of Greece under Xerxes over a century and a half earlier. This, combined with his insatiable ambition for glory and power, led Alexander to subjugate all the territories formerly part of the Persian Empire, including Palestine.
So in Palestine, the whole area is now incorporated first into the Persian Empire, and later into the Hellenistic Empire, and finally into the Roman Empire. Trade flourishes, international trade in this period, particularly maritime trade. And in the upper left, you see a stamped Rhodian jar handle, called Rhodian handles because they're often found in the island of Rhodes and from the island of Rhodes. These were mostly wine jars, shipped all over the Mediterranean, and they're stamped on the shoulder, often with the name of a local ruler and sometimes with an exact date.
Another great example of trade with the Greek world is this beautiful black glazed bowl known as Attic ware. It dates to the 5th century BC, the golden age of the Greek civilization, and it is called Attic because it comes from the territory of Attica in Greece.
Hellenistic, that is, Greek culture, was an unwelcomed byproduct that accompanied this trade. While the Jews had enjoyed freedom of religion under the Persians, Hellenistic rulers insisted that their subjects adopt the Hellenistic culture and religion of their kingdom. This attitude would spark a Jewish rebellion in 167 BC. This is known as the Maccabean Revolt.
In the center, you see several vessels of the Hellenistic period, particularly the 2nd century BC, the period of the Maccabean Revolts. These bowls are typical of that period. And on the extreme right, you see a little slipper lamp, and this is the very end form of almost 3,000 years of development. It's a single spouted lamp, and now it's pinched all the way closed. It's also very small and barely functional. After that, 2nd century BC, these lamps disappear forever, but they persist from at least 3300 BC to about 200 BC.
The Maccabean Revolt was successful in that it achieved political independence for the Jewish nation. The revolt was not successful, however, in removing Hellenistic elements from Jewish culture. A split developed between the Hellenized ruling class and an Orthodox Jewish faction, leading to civil war and the eventual collapse of the Jewish Hasmonean kingdom.
Herod was a remarkable character, getting himself elected king of the Jews by the Roman Senate in 37 BC. He's most famous for the reconstruction of the Jerusalem Temple, a project that took 2 years, but actually another 80 years to finish the magnificent temple courts and adjacent buildings, such as the portico or royal stoa. Of course, when we think of Herod, we think of a number of other building achievements, such as the Masada and Herodium fortresses, and the founding of Caesarea Maritima on the coast, a port city that was named after Caesar himself. One of the most remarkable discoveries was made in 2007 when Ehud Netzer of the Hebrew University, with whom I had the pleasure of excavating at Masada some years earlier, finally discovered the tomb of Herod the Great at Herodium. It took Professor Netzer 35 years to make that discovery. Imagine dedicating your entire life to one single goal. It takes an enormous amount of commitment and perseverance to do that in archaeology. But Ehud Netzer was a person who did, and in the end, it paid off.
In the center, you see a couple of unguentaria. These are designed for including something with burials. These are for perfumed oils. You have the story of Jesus being anointed by his friends and disciples after his burial, and these are typically found in tombs of the Herodian period. On the right, at the bottom, is an upside-down bowl, a Megarian bowl made from a mold. These are among the kinds of luxury wares that we find. And it's very interesting, in the Jewish quarter in Jerusalem, the typical finds are typically Roman, not very different from what you would expect to find in Roman elite houses. So while these were Orthodox Jews, they were very worldly in some of their habits. On the extreme right is a little limestone measuring cup, one of a series that we know, graduated just like canisters would be in a modern kitchen, and they were used in Jewish kitchens. They're peculiar to the Jewish community, and they're made of stone because according to Jewish ritual law, stone vessels are easier to make kosher if anything happens to them.
It is during the Roman period that Jesus was crucified. This transcendental event in history sparked the movement of Christianity that swept the world.
One of the famous stories Jesus told was of the 10 virgins in the wedding feast. When the bridegroom was delayed, 5 virgins were prepared with extra oil, but 5 had to leave and find more oil to keep their lamps burning. When the bridegroom did finally arrive, only half of the young maidens were ready to meet him. Jesus told stories like this, using examples from daily life that people could relate to. The typical Herodian lamp is the second one from the bottom in the foreground. Everyone listening to the story would have thought of this lamp. They would have known that the olive oil used would have been only good for about an hour and a half to 2 hours. They would have understood the wedding imagery. Today, thanks to these examples that we have discovered through archaeology, we can better comprehend as well.
We've talked a lot about lamps because we have in this museum an absolutely complete sequence from start to finish. Lamps, of course, are functional, but they're also highly symbolic, and perhaps it's just as well to end the exhibit this way, because just as Judaism became a light to the nations, as the prophets foretold, so did Christianity as well.
The prophet Isaiah prophesied, "The land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali, by the way of the sea, beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles. The people who sat in darkness have seen a great light, and upon those who sat in the region and shadow of death, light has dawned." This concludes our audio journey into